So we're going to welcome Peter. So Peter is been part of the Denver Decrim campaign back in 2019. That Denver Decriminalized was the first city by decriminalize mushrooms, and Peter's been part of that. Been a part of the advocacy and reform efforts like in the years since. Just a sort of a staple of that activist community that's been really working hard on like decriminalization efforts. And has done some research, so has that like behind the scenes from like very early organizing days of like what's been going on the ground in Colorado, and has also brought just a lens of sort of critical analysis to some of the languaging and some of what's happening. So Peter's here as a just informed community member to share some of this like backstory and some of this critical analysis. I will also let everybody know that we have invited the Natural Medicines Health Act people to our Denver meetup to share with us what they're excited about with the Natural Medicines Health Act, and to take questions and kind of dialogue as a community with them also. So just so you know, we are trying to bring some fairness and balance to some of these discussions and highlight multiple different angles and sides. But with that, here tonight, we're talking with Peter. And so he gets to lead us in this little dialogue. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll just kind of hang out and mingle like we normally do. So can everybody help me welcome Peter? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, I have to get a sense of the mic here. Thank you, Shannon and Rob, and and the NOAC Society for hosting this tonight. This is fantastic to be able to come and meet with you, and thank you so much for coming, for your interest in learning about these initiatives. This is so important for Colorado's future. Just a quick disclaimer and a little bit about me. First and foremost, I am not a lawyer. Please don't take anything here as legal advice. You're responsible for knowing and acting in accordance to the law and in taking care of yourself, your own well-being. So thank you. What I do have to offer is over a dozen years of working with language. I worked for a long time doing research, writing technical reports, and doing critical analysis for an energy company here in Boulder. Did that for over a decade, 12 years. And I was also the managing editor for their lead publication for 7 years, so I've got quite a bit of experience of looking at words. My entry into the psychedelic space began in 2018, kind of through some serendipity, and I got involved with the 2019 Denver Decrim and was a field coordinator on that. I got pulled into the statewide stuff this past year through the Mycoalition process. They had a series of town halls, and through attending those, I was introduced to the language, and as I read through the language, I started noticing red flags that popped up for me, and that inspired me to dig deeper and do a more thorough analysis on it. So what I'm going to be presenting to you tonight is a result of that work. I've had varying degrees of dialogue with some of the folks at New Approach about what's in here to try to clarify some of the concerns that came up, and that didn't fruit a whole lot. I've also consulted with 3 different lawyers to varying degrees about different parts of the language to get their opinions on what's here. And I've had countless conversations with other folks. So I've done quite a bit of due diligence to try to figure out, clarify what I was seeing. And with all that being said, I may not have gotten everything completely perfect and correct. So just bear that in mind. This is strictly my opinion. Click it out. This is strictly my opinion. I'm not representing any other person or group, although others certainly may share these views. I am striving to really be impartial and factual as best I can as I go through this, and I'm going to be looking at both initiatives and the pluses and minuses in both of them. Though given the nature of the material, as you'll see, it does come down pretty decidedly on one side, in part because of just what's in there, and I'll show you why. The other reason in a second. I don't see my role as necessarily as an advocate. I am more of like the pedestrian walking by the bridge and noticing cracks in the foundation and saying, hey, what's going on here? We need to pay attention to this. So that does not make me necessarily for or against bridges. I'm just seeing cracks. So full disclosure, based on the evidence that I've collected and I've seen, I do support 61 and I don't support 58, so you know my bias from up front. though at the end of the day, if neither were to actually pass, I would be fine with that, because there was a suggestion made in one of the meetings that we should just sit on this for 2 years and debate it and talk about it in community, and I'm all for that. But New Approach didn't want to do that, so they forged ahead, and so did 61. So here we are. Okay, I'm going to leave the rest of that for later. And bring me and the other boys home. 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 Those lines are from John Denver's song, hence the sunflower, from 1969. Anybody got a guess as to what was going on the world stage in 1969? Vietnam. Thank you, Vietnam War. Bring me and the other boys home. You get the clue here that the song is about the Vietnam War. So the whole song, for the whole song, you're not really quite sure what's going on. You're hearing about Josie and her child and how they're lonely and missing their husband and trying to fill the time. And it's not till you get to the end of the song where you hit those lines and you start to see, oh, there's something else going on here. And what John does, which I don't quite do as good a job singing it, but don't pretend to be that. He takes those two lines and is able to shape. Temporary pause.
You can try with that.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, just pass.
Battery died.
Oh, geez. Okay. Alrighty then. We're just going manual. So if you can't hear me in the back, let me know, and we'll try to project louder. Okay, good. Thank you. John Denver. So that first line, "Bring me and the other boys home," it's fairly. The meter is fairly straight. There's no change in it. And so your focus ends up being on me, the word me. Bring me and the other boys home. And so what you're seeing is the family scene. The me, the soldier, the wife, and the child. And then on the second verse, he changes the meter and changes the inflection such that as you go up on the, it's like going up the front end of a roller coaster. And you hit the E on the and you fall off the other side and you come crashing down into the word other. Bring me and the other boys home. And what he does is he's able to take your focus and he shifts it. And he shifts it from the me to the other. And with that, he also changes your empathy. He redirects your empathy. And so now you went from the local family unit to now this bigger, broader community thing. So it's just a tiny little nuance, same exact words, but a nuance in how it's done completely changes the focus of the meaning. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today is nuance and the power of language. Wow, isn't a language amazing? How you can do something that broad with just such a small change. Just a quick outline of what we're going to do today, what we're going to cover. This is going to be a fairly technical look at the language in these initiatives, and we have a lot to cover, so if you could hold your comments and questions to the end, that would be great. I'm going to go over a few broad questions trying to dissect what's in here. How do these two initiatives support the local community? How do they enable equity? Why are there even two initiatives? Can hit on some other language points and then get into what I consider the spirit of the medicine, and then talk about what the future is going to look like here. Quick look at the, just to give you a sense of timeline for all of this. There was a first meeting back in June with it was a small meeting with certain individuals. A New Approach came into the state and said, hey, we want to do this thing in Colorado. There was some dissatisfaction with how that meeting happened, and some people walked out on the meeting. It was a bit of a thing. As a result of that, the community came together and started having these town hall meetings under the umbrella of the Mycoalition, and that's all these yellow squares you see down here on the bottom. Those were all town hall meetings. On the 18th of November, I think it was 18th or 18th or 19th, one of those there, New Approach submitted their first drafts of their language, 48 and 49. Those were subsequently dropped because they went to two other drafts. 58 is the one that they adopted. That was submitted on the 20th. The other red square, the green square, is when 61 was submitted. And that blue square, blue week on the end there is the phase where they did an online draft. We'll talk about that later, but just to kind of give you an idea of where in the time scale all of this happened. So let's talk about how these two initiatives support the local community. And before jumping into that, I do want to just quickly highlight. So one of the reasons I said that we're going to be talking a lot about 58 is because it's got more for me to talk about. Part of that is just simply length. So this is 61. This is the entirety of 61. It's a very short, 3/4 of the page document. This is 58. 18 pages long. There's a lot in here, and if you ever need some help getting to sleep, it's a great thing to dive into on the bedside. I'm sorry?
Same amount of lobbying money for each one?
Yes, there is lobbying money in play, I'm sure.
Is it the same for each one?
Oh, same for each one. Oh, I didn't get the full question.
I was just thinking that maybe it'd be about the same stack of money.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, let's jump into the first point here. 61 provides a full and true decrim. What that means is it removes all criminal penalties for possession, cultivation, usage of 4 entheogenic plants and fungi. It's psilocybin, DMT, ibogaine, and mescaline. Both initiatives actually cover both the same medicine, so it's the same step for both. And what that does is it allows people to come out into the light with their usage of this and to be able to do this in a safe way. One of the primary functions of that is it allows abuse to be called out. Right now in the underground, if something happens and you wanted to report it, it's really hard because you would be putting yourself under the threat of criminal prosecution because you were doing something illegal. So decrim allows you to come out into the open, so it really helps to address abuse in the space. 58 has what they call a personal use section. It's sort of a decrim, and we'll get into the strict details on that a little bit later. I consider it a partial decrim, and it is subject to regulatory control. It does allow abuse to be called out to an extent that it is actually a decrim. With the, I'm sure many of you have seen this great little meme before, showing the difference between equality and equity, and this has kind of got some added bits with the reality and liberation parts as well. 61, by removal of penalties, it helps to level the playing field for everybody. It's not quite a true equity play because it doesn't support any specific groups that might need support in order to be able to get full access, but it does remove penalties for everybody. There's no special call-outs that are needed for anyone in particular. On the subject of equity, I wanted to bring out one of the first points in the language with 58 that was interesting. It's got what I call an unequitable start. There's no implementation delay for the regulated program, and this was a bit of an issue because the community had specifically requested this. The community was concerned that they wanted space for the community healing model to grow and develop on its own before a big corporate for-profit structure was allowed to come in. And they were concerned that that would just come in and blow away all the small players in the community, and they would have no chance for competing. So they voiced these concerns. New Approach's answer was that, oh yeah, there's an 18-month delay that we've put into the language. Well, it turns out that the actual language that they use are the words no later than. So it's like, if your homework is due no later than tomorrow, does that mean your homework has got to be turned in tomorrow, or is that when you start your homework? It's when your homework is due. So they did a little job of misleading on whether it was a delay or a deadline. What's actually in there is a deadline. This is the point at which the program must be completed, must be implemented. The program must be implemented no later than XYZ date. It's not a can't start until. And that might seem like a relatively minor point, but this is one piece that I'm going to thread together that shows that there's been a series of misleading statements coming out of New Approach as to what's actually in this initiative. So 61 provides a base, but not a framework for the community healing model. And with the community healing model, I'm talking about, where right now there's an underground, there's other practitioners that do stuff related to these medicines, but it's not able to operate above the light. So what Decrim does is it allows that to come up above ground, and it provides a foundation for them to work on because they don't have to worry about prosecution, but it doesn't actually show how that community model would be implemented or how that would actually happen in practice. And there's a lot of questions to be answered on how to do that in real life. 58, on the other hand, provides quite the framework. It provides a structure through the regulation for the access program, and as we'll talk about, it also provides regulation for the personal use section. With 61, in a Decrim model, the community would have direct decision-making authority because there is no top-down approach to it. There's no authority telling you what to do. And with that setup also comes a huge amount of responsibility because it's on the community to get this right. With 58, the community has no direct decision-making authority. All authority rests with the governor, who appoints the board. There's an advisory board that advises DORA, who is the regulatory agency that would oversee the program. So all authority rests with the governor and with DORA. And DORA is going to be the one that actually dictates what this healing model will look like. 61 does not allow for corporations. It does not protect corporations. The language it uses is, it protects natural persons. And that means an individual, like you or me, a flesh and blood human being. And corporations are a different entity in the language of the law. And so it would not protect. So you couldn't set up an LLC and practice your civil service under a Decrim. And so one downside of that is you don't have the inherent liability protection that would come from having something like an LLC. Because it only protects natural persons, so you as an individual. You'd have to file, if you were to file your taxes for this, you would have to file as a sole proprietor, and there's no legal liability protection there. 58 allows corporations to operate within the program without limit. There's no restrictions on them, but you do get this liability protection through that regulated system. And I want to clarify one thing too. So I heard the term legal being thrown around a little while ago. It's not legal like cannabis is. You would not be able to go to the corner store and buy mushrooms. You have to go to a licensed healing center and work with a licensed facilitator to get access to the medicine through the regulated model.
Under 58.
Under 58, yeah, thank you. Under the Decrim, there's no sale either. It's also just, in that case, you're allowed to grow it for yourself and you're allowed to gift it to other people. 61 is, as a Decrim, that's geared toward the Colorado market. I mean, it's possible that out-of-state players could come in, but without being able to set up a corporation, that's not a huge incentive. Like, you're not going to make a lot of money coming here to do that, so it's not a huge incentive driving that. 58 does allow out-of-state corporate players. This is another kind of hitching point with the community. They wanted some kind of residency requirement, like you have to be a resident of Colorado to do this facilitator healing center thing. And they refused, New Approach refused to put that in there. So with that, let's take a dive into one of the really important points in the language here. Here we get into the nuance bit. John Denver. The difference between individual and person. Individual, in lots of the Colorado statutes, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, it refers to natural person. Again, that's a flesh and blood human being, you and I. The word person, in common parlance, we wouldn't even think anything about this, but legally, it can refer to either an individual or a corporation. It can include both. And the best way to make this clear when you're writing a piece of legislation is to actually define what those terms mean right up front. There are some general definitions in the Colorado statutes that apply to everything, but there's exceptions, and it's not always quite clear. So the best thing to do is just define it in the actual document. And here's an example of one that does this. This is from one of the Colorado credit statutes, the consumer credit statutes. And here, subparagraphs 11 and 12, boom, clear as day. Individual means a natural person. Person means all these things. Individual, corporation, LLC, does not include government, agencies, etc. Crystal clear, there's no doubt as to what those terms refer to. So why do we care about this? Well, there's a particular call out in the 58 language that asked DORA to make a rule about something in particular, and that's this. It's asking DORA to make rules that prohibit an individual from having a financial interest in more than 5 healing centers. This goes back to the community's request to have some protection against big money coming in and just kind of dominating the whole market, to allow that community model to develop. And guess what? They use the word individual here. Well, after what I just told you, what are we looking for in the document? Where is the definition? Well, they didn't include it. There are no definitions for individual or person in this document. Okay. There are no definitions in here, and so it's not clearly defined. It's not defined at all. So as a result, what does that mean? What we're left with is we have to fall back on how that word is used in the document. And it turns out that the word individual, every time it's used in a document, in the context that it's used, it refers to natural persons. So even though the proponents, or not the proponents, the affiliates of 58 claim that this statement prohibits corporations from having financial stakes in more than 5 centers, that's not what this word means in this document. It means natural person. And who's going to come in and set up a healing center under their name? It's going to be under a corporation. So in effect, this really doesn't do anything. So yeah, it restricts natural persons. It doesn't restrict corporations. And so here's where some of my frustration bubbles up. If that's what you intended, then why didn't you just say it? It would have been so easy to say that prohibit an individual or corporate entity. I mean, the first step would have been just to define the terms, and then it was crystal clear. You can use them consistently throughout, and there's no question. Another easy way is just individual or corporate entity. There would be no question. It would be crystal clear, but they didn't do it that way. And to quote a friend of ours, Duffy, the language is unnecessarily ambiguous. It didn't have to be this way. Such a simple change. Why did they miss that? Let's talk about equity issues. 58 has some very progressive elements in it, which is great, and I believe most of this came out of community dialogue and community requesting, hey, this is what we want to see. It's asking DORA to make rules to ensure that the program is equitable and inclusive, and to promote the licensing and provision of services to people from communities disproportionately harmed by controlled substances arrest, who face barriers to health care, traditional indigenous history with natural medicines, and veterans. Got a few other pieces here. Allows limited waivers of education and training requirements for prior experience, including use with experience with natural medicines. And it's asking them to not impose unreasonable financial or logistical barriers to getting a license or operating. So kudos to the New Approach group for doing that. That's fantastic. And none of this is set in stone. I remind you that all decision-making authority rests with DORA. The community has no direct decision-making authority. They can bark and scream all they want, but at the end of the day, DORA gets to decide what happens. And if we look at what's happened in Oregon, 2 years ago, Oregon passed sort of a similar measure with psilocybin therapy there. And there was a group that sought to get an exemption to their regulatory group, which is called the OHA, that's the equivalent of DORA, that sought to get the OHA to grant exemption to entheogenic practitioners. These are people who've worked with the medicines traditionally. And it turns out the Oregon DOJ shot it down, Department of Justice in Oregon. And they gave many reasons for it. Some of them had to do with the specific language in the Colorado Initiative 109. But the final one was the most interesting for Colorado because they cited the US Constitution. And they equated entheogenic practitioner with religion. And because of that, they were able to say, you cannot give preference to a religious thing over a secular thing. It violates the US Constitution. Therefore, you cannot have an exemption for entheogenic practitioners. They have to go through the same program that everyone else goes through in Oregon. So even though 58 has all these great promises, it's unclear if it would actually be able to deliver that. Oregon is in a different federal jurisdiction, federal district. So their ruling isn't directly bindable to Colorado, but it does set precedent. And there's also a long history of indigenous medicine usage being denied at the federal level. Even though they're supposed to be granting permits for this kind of thing, they don't do it. And so there's kind of an uphill battle. There's a much bigger picture that needs to be dealt with here before language like that might actually be implementable. So they can promise all they want, but it's unclear if they could actually deliver. The other interesting piece that came out of Oregon, one of the other interesting pieces, many pieces, there's so much regulatory overhead that, with testing the compounds, the medicines, making sure they're pure, and transporting them. They've got to be in an armored car, and there's all this kind of crazy stuff that adds a lot of expense. They basically concluded that low-income individuals are not going to be able to afford treatment in their program because it's just too expensive. So it's unclear how that's going to roll out in Colorado. So the end results for all of those promises are to be determined. 58 also has some troubling elements in it. There is no language to prevent the advisory board from having conflicts of interest. And we saw this rear its head in Oregon. The head of their advisory board, who is also the head of the training subcommittee, had not financial stakes, he had 3 companies that were operating in the space. And this finally came to a head, and he was forced to resign, or voluntarily resigned, however you want to look at it. But there is no language in here that says the advisory board cannot have financial stakes in the Colorado market. The 58 language also talks about record sealing, which on the surface is a great thing. So if you have a prior conviction for something having to do with these medicines, then you could seal those records. And it says it's free to file. Again, we're talking about nuances in language here. So it's free to file, which is a pretty nominal cost, but who pays when the DA challenges your attempt on the application, or who pays when the DA rejects it and you have to go to appeal? There's a lot of legal time that gets pulled in that, in attorney fees and attorney hours, and so it can get a bit pricey. And it's, again, ambiguous language. It doesn't sound like it would actually cover all that. It may just be the initial filing, which doesn't do a whole lot. And this is a biggie for me. When I hit this, it kind of like blew my top. Any public or private source can give any amount of money to the program. So that means the regulated entities, the companies that are being regulated, can give any amount of money to the regulator. Now, who thinks that's a good idea? It seems like a baked-in system to encourage buying of influence. And this is written into the language of 58. This is specifically written in that this is allowed. When approached, the New Approach affiliates answered, well, this was done to encourage philanthropy. Since when do regulators need philanthropy? There are much better ways to do this. You know, if you've ever heard of the United Negro College Fund or the American Indian College Fund, these are separate funding mechanisms that people can give money to, and they then distribute that money to whatever groups that are in need of it. So whether that be a disadvantaged community or somebody, you know, communities that have been disproportionately subject to criminal prosecution, whatever. There's other mechanisms that are way better than just giving money to the regulators. So it begs the question of why do they do this? Why are they allowing people, the regulated entities, to give money straight to the regulators? Kind of tied in with that is this idea of where is the corporate incentive in all this? This is from, I don't know if, are you all familiar with Compass Pathways? Some people. They are a psilocybin company, and they are actually trying to patent not just the psilocybin medicine, but the entire therapeutic process around that. And in their SEC filing, they specifically cited the city of Denver and their decrim effort in 2019, and stated that the legalization of psilocybin could impact their commercial sales and increase competition. They see decrim as a direct competitive threat. So there's a market incentive here to limit decriminalizations, at least with some companies. A little bit on equity with 61. It's not trying to set up a large-scale program for anything. It's only providing a base for community-scale systems to operate. By removing that fear of prosecution, it allows that local grassroots effort to develop. It could eventually be turned into a regulatory model. My ideal vision is where we have a couple of years to work on this and we get something going, and then that progresses, and eventually at some point maybe it feels ready to say, okay, we're ready to codify this into law and make it a more broadly applicable thing. But it would take time to get there. And the 61, yeah, like I said before, it applies to everybody in the state. There's no special call-outs that are needed to approve. So you don't have to say, oh, this group needs special attention or that group needs special attention to get decrim. It applies to everybody. But then that does create a situation of where it's an inequality, not a true equity issue. So communities that have trouble getting access to it would still need some kind of assistance. So we're going to dive into why are there two initiatives. We get this question a lot, and to do that, we're going to have to go into a little bit of history. And I'm posing this overarching question of, if you're from out of state, how do you build trust with the local community? That's what happened here. We had an out-of-state entity come into Colorado and say, hey, we want to do this thing. We want to work with the community. Okay, great. And they started these dialogues. And so what I see as necessary is you need transparency, you need honesty, cooperation, and the philosophy of putting community first. So let's see how all of that measures up. On the subject of transparency, New Approach has been asked multiple times, who's actually in your organization? Who makes up New Approach? And we've gotten various answers. 4 people. So one person piped up and told us, oh, and he gave the names of 2 dead people, 2 dead guys. Like, what good does that do us? And then finally, Graham Boyd, which everyone knew. Graham Boyd is, well, maybe we'll talk about him later. And Ben Unger, and then 2 women. Like, why can't you just tell us who's in your group? Like, why the smoke and mirrors? So you can feel my frustration coming out. Like, these are really simple questions. It doesn't take a whole lot to answer this, and yet they're choosing not to divulge this information. Where do you get your funding? You're an out-of-state PAC, Political Action Committee. Where do you get your funding? Rich people. Rich people give us money. And then this last one, angel donors. These are direct quotes from New Approach affiliates, from interviews and such. Everything I've got in quotes here are direct quotes from the New Approach affiliates. Angel donors. I did not get to ask them, are those ascending angels or descending angels? I'm being sarcastic, but the point is, without actually telling us who they are, you haven't told us anything. Smoke and mirrors. Not necessary to do this, but this is what they're doing. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of those equity pieces that are in 58 that I applaud, that came out of community discussions with them, so that was great. As we kind of progressed, if you remember that calendar and those yellow squares moving down, tension started to rise because the local community felt like their concerns were not being heard. And so in response to this, New Approach decided, hey, let's put up online a draft copy of our language and allow everybody to go in there and make comments and make suggestions, and we'll gather all that information and make a much better initiative out of this. So that's what they did. They put this thing up for a week, and the results coming out of New Approach said that the initial draft was substantially revised. Sounds great. So what I did was I took that initial draft, I compared it to the final copy that was submitted to the state and was accepted by the state, and I noted every single change that happened. Then I went back and I looked at every single comment that was made, and then I correlated those comments to what changes happened to see what comments actually resulted in changes. Here's a few examples of the comments. Every comment was important, but there certainly was a gradient of importance to material difference in the outcome. So a few of the big ones: please include language that expressly states that DORA has no purview over personal use. Do not give all power to the regulatory agency. Remove all language that could be used to establish possession limits. And just to give you an idea of some of the lesser importance pieces, hey, these 2 paragraphs, let's flip the order of those 2 paragraphs. It would look nicer. So overall, there were 57 distinct changes suggested in this phase. Out of that, 6 changes were made to the language. And out of those 6, only 1 had any significant material difference. So when they claimed it was substantially revised, I am confused, and to me it looks substantially unrevised. So this was more of a show and very little substance here, and actually working with the community and cooperating to get the community's needs addressed. The other piece, so this is a big one, removal of numerical limits. This actually happened before that online draft phase. The community was very adamant about, and some of the, this came a lot from the Decrim Nature camp that's in Colorado here, that their philosophy is, and I'm in this camp too, not to set them apart as another. This is nature. These are things that nature has given us. There is no reason these things should be criminal. These are fungi, these are plants. This is just what's there in front of us, given to us by nature. We have a natural right to these things. So the initial drafts of 49 and 50 had numerical limits in there. They had a possession limit of 4 grams of the psychoactive substance. community had a big uproar. They took those out. They said, okay, we're going to take out the limits. Fantastic. Well, when they came out with 58, draft 58, they added this new piece of language in there. For the purpose of this Article 170, personal use means that personal ingestion or use of a natural medicine includes the amount a person may cultivate or possess of natural medicine necessary to share medicines with other people 21 years or older within all these different contexts. So what the heck does that mean? Personal use is an amount that a person may cultivate or possess necessary to share with other people. So this certainly raised a red flag for me and many other people in the community, and we began asking questions like, what's going on here? It looks like you're trying to set limits. We just said no limits, and you just said you took them out, but now we've got this language. What's going on? And then throughout all of this too, there was a lot of claims that personal use section is a completely separate component in this initiative. It is not subject to DORA's regulatory purview. It's in a lockbox. It's a completely separate piece. So let's keep that concept in mind as we go through these language points. Before we dissect this definition, I want to hit a couple of other points in the language. At the very start of the personal use section, it includes this language, subject to the limitations in this Article 170. Subject to the limitations. What that means is, question marks, it makes all of personal use subordinate to the rest of the document, such that anything found anywhere in the document that could be seen as a limitation can be applied to personal use. So instead of this lockbox idea, a completely separate piece, what we're seeing in the basic construct of personal use, the initial setup of that section, is that it's subject to the limitations found anywhere in the document. And one example of a limitation found elsewhere is right here. This is under the program structure, and it's asking DORA to establish rules, to do all these things, and one of them is to adopt, amend, and repeal rules as necessary to implement the program. That's expected, of course. And another piece is to protect the public health and safety. Well, what exactly does that mean? It doesn't say to protect the health and safety of those in the program. It says the public health and safety. Public is everybody. Is this giving DORA authority to regulate personal use as they see fit? Isn't it supposed to be in its own little separate entity, separate lockbox? So back to this definition and dissecting what the heck this thing means. Assurances were given, so this raised, like I said, it raised alarm bells. The community started saying, hey, what's going on? New approach affiliates came back, and these are some of the things that they came back with. The Act does not give the department or any other regulatory agency oversight over this section or the power to define, restrict, rule make, or otherwise exercise authority over the conduct set forth in this section. The Act provides the department authority only over the regulated access program. It does not grant the department authority over the personal use provisions. These are pretty strong statements. Very crystal clear. Hey, this thing is separate. It's completely isolated. This was I received in personal communication with one of the affiliates from New Approach. We can also, when we meet with them, and I'm talking about meeting with the Secretary of State, they have a series of meetings, they have to work to coordinate the initiative process. When we meet with them, clarify what our intent is with certain provisions, which creates a legislative record of what the language means that can then be relied upon later. And then these two are more recent. Possession of any amount of natural medicine does not constitute reasonable suspicion of a crime. DORA does not have statutory authority on this matter, referring to personal use. Does anybody in here know who the title board is? Ah, all right, one person over there. Two people. I know you know. So when you submit an initiative to the state, you go through the process, you provide your language, and you go through a couple of meetings, and then one of these meetings is what's called the title board. They actually set the title that appears on the ballot. So the language that you see on the ballot is set by the title board. And they have what's called the final hearing. So at this final hearing, these are some of the statements that came out. They were discussing personal use because one of the title board members asked, hey, I see this language here about limited personal use. What's going on here? And so their legal counsel gets up and starts going into some of the stuff here. The purpose is still to have it limited, talking about personal use. Limited as to the purpose of the use here, as opposed to the previous measure, we established black letter statutory quantities. The grammar is kind of off. These are quotes from people talking, so it's not exactly the best sentence structure, but so take that as it is. Black letter statutory quantities that's reference to when you put a hard-coded number into the statute, that's what that refers to. It's just a solid number versus a vague amount. Essentially, what we are saying by limited by purpose rather than set numerical, we are allowing implementation in case law to be the determinant of what the reasonable definition of personal use is. Implementation is how you implement the program. So that goes back to DORA and what the regulations that they set are. Case law, well, in this case, case law is the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, going back to the initial drug war, of this prohibition mindset. So they're saying, we want case law to determine what personal use should be. The whole point of decrim is to get away from all of that. Is to say, hey, this was the wrong philosophy. Nature is free. We should be able to access this stuff without fear of prosecution. And now they want case law, this history of prohibition mindset, to determine how to define this stuff. And then finally, this was the real kicker here. It's an intended deference to the rulemaking process, to the advisory board informed rulemaking process. We're shifting it from a legislative to a regulatory process. So they're just establishing what the reasonable definition of personal use is. This is the heart of the personal use section, defining what personal use is. The advisory board informed rulemaking process. There is only one advisory board in this statute, in this initiative, and it's the one that's advising DORA. And DORA is they don't actually name DORA, but there's only one advisory board, and there's only one entity that does the rulemaking, that's DORA. So they're referring to DORA. Now let's contrast this with the assurances we were given. This act does not give power to a rulemaker, does not grant the department authority over personal use provisions. And then in this personal communication, we're going to clarify what the intention is. Well, wasn't that foretelling the future? Because the intention was set to regulate it. What is going on here? Thank you. What is going on here? Why are they misleading the public? These are 180-degree different statements than what was stated in the final hearing. And by the way, the final hearing happened 2 weeks before these top two came out, were published. So these were published after the final hearing. So they knew what was in the final hearing. What's going on here? In short, DORA is being asked to set limits on personal use. That discussion was specifically about possession and cultivation amounts. But that language at the end where they say, we're shifting this from a legislative process to a regulatory one, leaves open the question of how much further they can go. And we've heard some explanation that the reason that this was done was to make it more politically expedient so that people will vote for this. The public would vote for it and support it. And that may or may not be true. You know, I don't know exactly what their intention was there. But one thing that we can say is that limiting personal use pushes people into the for-profit system. Remember the corporate incentive that I outlined earlier with Compass Pathways and that paragraph that allows unlimited amounts of money to be donated to the regulatory system? And now personal use is not in a lockbox and can be limited such that people are forced to go into the for-profit structure. And we have to ask, why the misleading statements? Why are they misleading the public as to the contents of this initiative? So let's revisit this question of, if you're from out of state, how do you build trust with the local? Well, with transparency, there's a lot of, please don't look behind the curtain. At the least, we've seen a lot of misleading statements come out of them. And in terms of cooperation and putting community first, in this online input phase, we can see the output there, what the result was. So to answer that question finally of why two initiatives, finally get to this answer, basically the community didn't feel its concerns were being addressed. And that's why 61, I mean, this is a bit of a simplistic explanation, I mean, but that's basically the gist of it. 61 had been in development for a little while, and it wasn't like they just cranked it out in the last week after that final hearing stuff came out. It had been in development, but that was the sense that was being picked up from New Approach that they weren't really listening. So if they can set possession limits, what about for sitting? Sitting for remuneration is almost surely out because you've got a whole regulated program where you've got to be a trained facilitator to get payment. Sitting for free, unclear. These are the only parts of the language that I could find that may even remotely apply to sitting. And these specific words, it'd be easier if I just put them together for you. You add these pieces together and it comes up with assisting another person in the action or conduct of using or ingesting natural medicine. Kind of vague sounding to me. Does that sound like sitting to you, providing sitting services? How does 61 do it? Crystal clear. Provision of supervision, guidance, therapeutic, harm reduction, spiritual, or supportive services with or without remuneration. You have to be 21 or older, blah, blah, blah. Contrast that again with this one. Which one is more clear to you? Again, ambiguous language. It didn't need to be this ambiguous. He could have made it way crystal clear, and they didn't. With sitting, it's actually, as far as I'm aware, there's actually no law that prohibits the actual act of sitting, but sitters can still be prosecuted currently through aiding and abetting the use of illegal substances. So it's kind of a workaround that you can be prosecuted through. And as far as I know, that's actually never happened in Colorado, at least. So it's the possibility that DORA's regulation of sitting could actually increase the ease of prosecution, because now they say, oh, you're violating our rules, and then that violates the CSA and triggers this whole thing. Quick note on facilitation, since we're talking about sitting. So facilitation is a term they use to refer to within the program. And the training requirements, of course, for Colorado haven't been developed yet because the thing's not even passed. But we can look to Oregon. In Oregon, you have to have a high school diploma and 120 hours of training. That's all you need to be a facilitator. Hairdressers require like 500 hours to be able to practice, but they're only asking 120 hours of training.
Police don't require that much either, though.
Sorry?
Police don't require that much either, less than hairdressers.
Really? Okay. Okay. Well, there's a whole nother discussion there.
Yeah.
And I have mixed views on what really is needed to train a facilitator, to be honest. But my prediction is that if something like that were to develop here, you're going to get a flood of new, cheap facilitation. These are people that didn't have to go through a 4, 6, 8-year program to get a therapy degree and work out all their stuff and make sure they're not going to be transferring things onto people and the sessions and all that stuff. All those things that you have rigorous training for therapists. But it would make it a lot cheaper. Which for existing therapists, that could be a problem, because now you're going to be competing against all these quote-unquote crackerjack diplomas, to use my friend Travis's term. So I don't know, it's the question of this is for better or for worse? Is there going to be an increased risk of harming people? If you're deep in medicine work and this person starts having all this crazy trauma come up, and they've got 120 hours of training, are they going to be able to deal with that? Is that safe? And not only does that could cause harm to people, what's the risk of causing harm to the movement? Another quick couple of points on the language itself, the structure of the language that's important. With 61, these changes here are hard-coded in the Controlled Substances Act. This is written straight into the Controlled Substances Act. It's very direct, and to change this, you'd actually have to go in and do a legislative process to change these. So it's pretty fixed, but it's also accessible. It's pretty easy to read and see. With 58, it's what I call a tripart authority structure. So you've got the Controlled Substances Act. What 58 will put into that is a reference that says, hey, if you think there's a violation here, go see 58. You go to 58. 58 says, hey, go see DORA and their regulations. And so you have to go down the chain to actually find out what the rules are. It's easier to change, so there's a little bit of an advantage there because you don't have to go through a whole process of changing the CSA. DORA just has to do a rulemaking. But it could also be easy to influence and or manipulate. And again, we go back to those provisions where anybody can give any amount of money to the system. Well, there's a built-in mechanism to buy influence. And another really important piece is here, it creates an undue burden on the average citizen to know the law. If you go before a judge for a crime, you're expected to know what the law is. But you're not expected to know what DORA's statutes, what DORA's regulations are. And so what this does is it puts it all into DORA. And DORA basically acts as a trigger And Doris says, okay, here's the rule. And if you violate that rule, well, then now, boom, all of a sudden you go up that chain. Now the CSA comes into effect because it's not in accordance with that chain. Spirit of the medicine. One of the lessons that I've gotten from working with medicine myself is that medicine, it's about allowing that inner healer to emerge. And in fact, we were in a room several years back before COVID, where Bruce back here gave us a talk about the MDMA program, where they were finding the exact same thing, where the therapists there were setting a container, a safe setting, and the real work was actually just allowing the person's own innate healer to come out. So it's the recognition that our divinity lies within us, and it's discovering, acknowledging, accepting, and embodying our own center. So how do these two initiatives align with that spirit of the medicine? 58 requires you to give up your personal power to outside authority, to the government, DORA, the governor. No decision-making authority for the indigenous, traditional Colorado-based underground. It's an attempt to codify inherently spiritual practice. It's an attempt to codify something that's still not well understood. 61, on the other hand, allows people to be their fullest selves by removing the fear of criminal prosecution. So you can just be you and not have to worry about going to jail for it. Provides base for a local, organic, self-determinant model to develop, although again, the responsibility lies entirely in the community to develop a community-based model to make that really work. So a quick review of 58, what have we seen? We've got an out-of-state pack, and they're here for the long haul. If you've watched any of the Oregon process, you've seen how New Approach continues to be an influence. They were the ones that backed 109 in Oregon. Sorry if I didn't explain that. They continue to be a presence there in shaping how that program manifests. And we can already see hints of that here, even before it's gotten on the ballot. So make no mistake, they've dropped $2.5 million just on collecting signatures. They don't drop that kind of money and walk away. There's some expectation they've got to be around. They won't disclose where their funding has come from. Misleading statements, the ambiguous language full of loopholes, this philosophy of not putting community first, the basic structure is an unrestrained for-profit regulatory system. You give up all power to the DORA and the governor. Local healers have no decision-making authority based on opposing the spirit of medicine, but at least it allows grandma to participate. One of their claims for why this is so important to rush through right now is because they want grandma to be able to go, and she's not going to go to a traditional healer. She wants to go to a doctor, somebody in the white coat. Well, that's great, and if grandma isn't called to do the medicine work, maybe grandma shouldn't be going to do the medicine work, is my response to that. I fully support broadening access to this to everyone, and I think it needs to be done in an appropriate way such that the community is able to integrate this work. It's a lot of work. If any of you have done medicine work, I'm sure you know this. It's not just about that session, it's about huge amounts of integration to actually bring that into your life. Quick review of 61, it removes that fear of persecution, allows abuse to be called out, provides base for the community healing model. Full weight of the healing model is on the community, and there's still some real equity issues that would need to be resolved to make that work. I've been asked this too, what if 58 is the only option on the ballot? What if 61 doesn't make it? Is this better than nothing? Hey, isn't this progress? We're getting something. Or is this a step in the wrong direction? Are we, as a community, ready to codify into law an inherently spiritual practice? And I mentioned this earlier, we don't quite understand how this medicine works entirely. The best researchers in the world are still trying to figure out how this stuff works. There hasn't been like this universal consensus of like, oh yeah, this is the way to do it, and maybe there is no one way to do it. How is this board of 15 people, an advisory board of 15 people, going to be able to make these decisions? And they're not paid, by the way, so it's a volunteer board. Who's going to have the time to do this? Your board is going to be pretty much exclusively people that are independently wealthy, that can afford to put all this time in because they're not being paid. And then finally, are you willing to build this bridge on all these cracks that we've seen tonight? And so then to the community here, I'm posing, what future will you create? What does a community-based model look like? How would you inform the public of best practices? One idea that was floated around was, hey, how about an information portal website kind of thing where that allows people to, here's best practices to look for, here are the questions to ask, here's what you do if there's a problem. Can you form a council of your own to discuss these issues and work all this stuff out? Decrim allows existing laws to come into play. If there's some kind of abuse, it can be called out and dealt with existing laws. But how else can the community protect and self-regulate? And then, as an important piece for the community is how can you work with DORA to accommodate licensing in a decrim system? So I'm not sure how exactly that would work. And one final piece to leave you on, if you refuse the call to assume your own divinity, to have self-determination, someone else is going to walk in and play God for you. So that's the choice that we have. And coming back to John Denver, which of course everything comes back to John Denver. Bring me and the other boys home. We look at the bigger picture too of how Colorado, how this whole thing is going to impact the rest of the nation. You know, what we decide here is going to have a big role in what happens to the rest of the country. So these are important decisions to make. All right, done, boom.
I was wondering if you could speak to the paradigm in which both initiatives make it on the ballot and they're both voting yes on, and if there's any way that they can reconcile with one another, or if that's a disaster.
There's some debate about that. 58 does have a provision in it that states that if there's another local provision that conflicts with it, 58 prevails, except where that local provision, I forget the exact wording, is something like local municipalities can enact laws that impose smaller standard or less strict standards or less strict penalties. And my read of that is, like, if we look at Denver's 301, I think it depends on how that local initiative is written. Denver's 301 does not actually impose penalties of any degree. It simply says you cannot spend money, you cannot spend resources to enforce the existing law. It doesn't change the existing law, it just says you can't enforce that law. So I'm not sure how that's going to get read. It could be read such that, well, you know, 301 doesn't set penalties, so that doesn't apply, and so 58 prevails.
But 58, my understanding, so we're not talking about a local ordinance with 61, we're talking about...
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah,
No,
with 61,
I'm
yeah.
curious, like,
Yeah, I'm sorry, I took it to another. Wait, yeah, okay, so, yeah, so 61, well, yeah, so that part, sorry, I totally confused your question with another, yeah. 58, so the Colorado statutes say that if two measures both pass, the one with the most votes prevails on any specific provisions where they conflict. So they address different parts of the CSA, so that doesn't conflict itself, but in practice, they do conflict. If DORA says, well, you now have a limit of you can only possess 6 grams, and Decrim says there's unlimited, well, there's obviously a conflict there. And if 58 gets more votes, then my guess is that that is going to prevail, and the limits will be set. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
I am a veterinarian, and as I read both initiatives, I think that my non-human patients are still, none of these apply to my work with my patients. Does that sound true from what you're interpreting?
Well, so what, could you use this medicine on animals, non-human patients?
Yes, I see too many persons rather than patient words. I think that's still very
I
human.
think, I haven't even thought about that before, but my off-the-cuff guess would be that no, it would not apply to non-human, because the language does not, individual person do not refer to non-human entities.
Yeah, I see a lot of persons and not patients, so I think it's very human to me.
But what puppy dog is going to call Dora on you if you're from therapy?
Well, this is the thing about that. Do we treat livestock as, do we have like designation for dogs as livestock? Like in Pennsylvania, dogs are treated as livestock. That's why puppy mills can exist.
But I think the question is, it's human, it is already human-based.
Well, all I was getting at is if you want to treat dogs and they're given to another category which separates them out, that might be the deciding thing. You know, if they're able to like experiment with that assumption.
it's still very cutting, like, I don't think it's on anybody's radar, because, like, doing the trauma work and the stuff that you're doing with, like, animals and vet care is, like, not, I mean, that's, like, beyond, I think, what anybody's sort of,
Yeah, it's interesting question. We can talk more about that with like the cannabis side, but I think for what we're talking about tonight, it's still very, very human-based.
yeah.
Well, if you can get in trouble for having, just having person,
Yes, and again, not to get us off track, for cannabis side, it's more when humans are doing their animal first, so that human-initiated is that, again, I think this doesn't touch animals as species. Yeah.
Yeah.
I moved to Oregon because of 109.
I'm sorry?
I moved to Oregon because of 109.
Okay.
And the one thing that allows me as a licensed therapist is the protections of the Oregon Psilocybin Board protects my license. If this does not involve DORA, I will not be protected, and I won't be able to practice legally. And that's the thing that worries me the most about 61. I believe in a lot of the elements of it, but I think the practical aspect to really mainstream this and to get this going is really not there. I'm worried about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I mean, I call that out one of my points of, the community would have to work with DORA. If 61 were to rule the land, they would have to work with DORA and try to figure out, is there some way to make this work? So I'm not sure, I'm not clear if that could happen, but that's certainly something.
That adds another 5 or 6 years to everything. If you're going to try to work with DORA, when you have an opportunity to at least open that door, I'm just curious, like how 61 has addressed people who are licensed and put their careers and specializations on the line to work in the field.
Yeah, I don't have a solid answer for you. Yeah, it is something that would have to be addressed with DORA. You're right. Was there something about
So I'm involved with 58,
Okay.
and I'm a little bit saddened by your approach of it's quite a negative view of a group that tries to more or less from a 100,000 foot perspective tries to do more or less the same thing. It's to give people more access, people that need it. And so when I hear you talk about community, I don't hear you talk about the clients, the people, the patients that would benefit from access to this. And so that's somewhat saddening. And there's a lot of, when I listen to you, there's a lot of distrust and paranoia, I would even call it, of where's the money coming from, and who is that, and what do they mean with this? My glass is always half full, and I'm a positive person, and this is already regulated. It's completely regulated. It's forbidden, right? DORA regulates already therapy. Not everybody can sit, right? You cannot be an unregulated therapist right now in Colorado. So there is already regulation. DORA is already involved. Even if Initiative 61 is the only one that gets approved by the voters, DORA will be all over this, because you cannot provide therapy to a suicidal person. And if you do, and the person commits suicide anyways, you're going to be on the hook for it. And so these medicines are extremely powerful. And I understand that there are a lot of people that have been working with this for a long time. But there is also a system of therapy out there, of the medicalization, right? And on a state level, and this is somewhat the middle ground. In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned Compass, which is at the extreme other end. Their goal is to monopolize the worldwide use of psilocybin. And so when you look at 58, that's somewhat a middle ground to say, okay, personal use, run with it, right? It's non-commercial, run with it, guys. But there is also another side. There is a need for people that need hand-holding, that come here for treatment of depression. And that's how it's going to be advertised. You're depressed, you're anxious, you have this and this and this problem. Why don't you come to me? I'll help you with that. That's regulated already. A sitter cannot make such claims. You have to go through a training program with 2,000 hours of therapy under supervision to become a licensed professional, counseling professional. And so to sit back and say, if we decriminalize it, it's very simple. And I appreciate your act with just one page, look how simple it is. And then look, here's, yes, if you are going to put it in the existing medical framework of the state, you have to use a lot of language to describe what you actually want to do with this, how you want to put that under the existing umbrella. And just to say, we keep it simple and we keep it open, that's not necessarily going to work either, because it's already regulated.
Thank you. Yeah, and you bring up several points there, if I can recall them all.
You bring up the issue of trust. And yes, I do have, like I said at the beginning, I do come down decidedly on one side because of the evidence that I've seen. Why the ambiguous language? Why the misleading statements? Why the smoke and mirrors? If there really is perfect intention with all this, then why not disclose this information? Why not be upfront? Why not be straight up with the community? And they haven't been. So what am I to conclude from that? It's just odd that someone who says they have good intentions, but they're not willing to actually give the community a seat at the table. They're directing all the shots with this. Why is that? So yes, so I do have reason to question whether, as an example of their past behavior, is that what we're going to expect going forward? Is that what we're going to continue to see going forward? Because here's what they've shown us, how they act. We had this community input phase and 57 comments and only one was actually changed. Okay, well, how much are they actually listening to community? So yes, so I do have reason to question. And you're right, with the community healing model, there's a lot to be worked out. One thing to point out with that, and 61 was not intended to allow, it was basically removing penalties so that people aren't going to jail for what should be seen as a natural right. It wasn't intended to create this whole model, and so that's why I was emphasizing it would be on the community to really figure these points out. And these are very important points, you're right. You don't want just anybody sitting for anybody. And like I was talking about, maybe you have this information portal where if someone was interested in this, they can go and find out, well, hey, what should I even be looking for? What questions should I be asking? Is there a system to address people who are operating out of bounds? Is there a system for the community to address, grievances? How would that be working? I mean, that's all a lot of detail work that would have to be done on the community's end. And 61 only allows individuals to do this. You could not set up an LLC or any other corporate structure. So you're not going to have this flood of big company kind of things happening to do sitting services, because you'd have incredible liability if you were to set up a building and all this stuff and have employees and you're not an LLC, you'd get hammered. The smallest thing, you'd get hammered. So no one's going to do that. So it's only allowing this small-scale community stuff to happen. Basically, what's happening now, the community underground work that happens, it would protect those people from prosecution just for possession. You're right, there needs to be a lot of work to address what the right way, what best practices are needed to provide safe healing services for people. Absolutely. But again, if it's a community, if the community would come together and form, say a community council and say, hey, let's get together and make decisions about what requirements do we want to see people have to be registered in our database. Okay, well, this is the training we expect. Here's the safety protocols we expect. Here's the oversight that we expect. And then the consumer could go to that and be like, oh, okay, well, this facilitator is in the program. Great. If they're not in the program, well, buyer beware. There's some degree there of personal responsibility. But you're right, those are a lot of important points that would have to be worked out. 61 is not meant to be a panacea that allows the whole sitting world just to bloom. It just provides a base.
Spell it out up front, and 58 did. Now you're holding the fact that it's a lot of language and a lot of unclear things, and maybe this is not that, they should have stated that differently, and who are you, and all of it. Yeah, they wrote a lot down, right?
Yeah, please, I want to say something else about this.
I'm just going to want to tag on and ask a little bit about this issue of the therapists who have training to sit, and then those of us who aren't therapists who've been doing this work for a long, long time, like over 20 years, and have our own set of parameters, contraindications, certain people that we won't work with. We do, rigorous kind of intake and that kind of thing. But my concern is that some of the regulation will leave us out of it. And so I'm curious what kind of dialogue may be going on that you know of, because I'm new to Colorado and I've been working in California and living there for a long time. And if you could address that at all. I'd like to see us work together to see how we can support the people and self-responsibility and help get out of that litigious model and help bring, because I think that's part of what the medicine does, is it teaches us how to be, find our sovereignty and our autonomy and our
Bruce, did you want to say something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I feel like this 61 has been talking to this whole issue of this whole community that we have all across the country of practitioners practicing. And it's allowing those people to come back and work and see. That's it. Then there's this whole other group, like me, that works above ground, works in research, blah, 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 blah. That's the medicalization thing. We're actually working that into too. So these are two different angles. So 61 is addressing this really important need for the community to be able to become visible, so we can actually see and talk about these people, talk about best practices as a group. Well, what are the best practices? I like how you said this, but that doesn't actually work for me, so that we can actually have these conversations. So that's what I see in 61, because we're not addressing this other issue, which is the other issue we're trying to, it's emerging, which is how do we deal with licensed therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, veterinarians, using this word. That's a different category than what 61 is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, 61 is really just a base. It does not provide the structuring, the scaffolding to build out the whole system. Yeah, right now you can't even have those conversations, right? Because you'd be persecuted. It's a starting point. And as I said in the beginning, I'm not for or against bridges. I'm not against the regulatory model. What I'm seeing are there are a lot of cracks in this version of the model that's being proposed. And so, is this something that we want to adopt as our first step? Maybe we should be looking at, let's build the base first and allow that to go organically sit for a couple of years, and then from there, eventually we can build a regulatory system that the community actually buys into.
And it is, okay, one more comment. We're just needing to wrap up. It's like a black hole, right? It happens every time. I don't know. Sorry. Go ahead, though.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what this gentleman said, I think in theory these two approaches can exist in parallel, and they do address very different communities. We have, for example, I would say 61 is mostly catering to the legacy community. People that have been using these substances for years, decades, generations, even thousands of years. And it kind of allows these substances to kind of be brought into the light in a way that kind of levels the playing field. And there's a whole contingent of the legacy community that doesn't want anything to do with the medical system, or they've been completely spurned by the medical system in the United States. And you can even argue that the paradigm that psychedelic substances work on does not exactly mesh with the paradigm of the medical system. Whereas conversely, there is an effort to try and integrate psychedelics into the medical system, and then there's a whole other contingent of therapists who have that therapist training, and then the cohort in our society, for example, the grandmothers, the soccer moms, the people who would never feel comfortable having these experiences with, a legacy practitioner who, I want to be with a doctor. So there are entirely different contingents in our society who would benefit from, these different approaches. The sticky thing is we can recognize that these approaches can exist in parallel, they can exist at the same time. It's just a matter of reconciling with the fact that one domain wants to preclude the other domain, because in the United States there is this supremacy of the medical culture. The doctor is regarded as the ultimate authority, and we've seen Compass, we've seen with the infrastructure, the medical industrial infrastructure that might come about from regulation, like the medical complex is integrated into the industrial complex. So we're going to see a medical industrial complex come about, and corporations are going to do what corporations want to do. They're going to want to maximize their bottom line. They're going to want to stomp out competition. So there is an avenue for, if corporations want to offer those services, fine, let them offer those services for the grandmothers. But the syntax is important because we want to make sure that the level field is the playing field is completely leveled before we allow the corporations to come in and start offering those services. Because if they come first, they'll try to lobby and rig the system and use their financial leverage in a way that will try to preclude the legacy communities from practicing the way they practice. Thank you.
So, thank you. I know there's more to say, and and we will have more conversations. And I appreciate Bruce pointing out how there's different angles here. There's different communities of practitioners that we're trying to honor and take care of and bring up or protect. And so it's really complicated. And I can appreciate the diversity of backgrounds and perspectives in the room and different spaces that we're all operating in, and wanting to make sure that the people that we work with in our communities are represented and there's access and there's room for everybody in this. So it's incredibly complicated. I do think personally with a good full decrypt that we could probably legislatively protect licenses and keep it really simple rather than a highly complicated, multi-layered regulatory scheme for the safest psychoactive substance that exists, like mushrooms. I don't know why we need lots of layers of regulation to that. But anyways, I guess since I'm the host, I get to have the last word.